Coming up, the Atkinson Cycle. It just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it, in car reviews and glossy marketing, this and that. What is it? What does it actually mean? And it's becoming more commonplace, so you might as well know the nuts and bolts and the beer garden physics of how the hell that works. That's next. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au, and I get new cars cheap. Yes. Together with my mighty drill bit. Number whatever, Morse taper. I love that. Hurts so good. Website for that, obviously. Or you can just click the card that I sometimes put, up there now, dude. The Atkinson Cycle. Okay, it's part of a combustion philosophy, I guess you'd say, that goes with eco cars increasingly. Toyota uses it in all of those hybrids, and that means Lexus as well in any of those little 400H or something vehicles that Lexus produces. Hyundai uses it in the Palisade 3.8 V6 multi-point front driver, I think, and Kia uses it in the Seltos 2-litre CVT as well. There are plenty of others, and it's becoming more of a salient feature on the internal combustion landscape as we move into this ecologically sensitive phase of the automotive industry. And to anyone who thinks that battery EVs are just going to wipe out internal combustion overnight, I mean, it's a nice theory, but I don't see it happening. It's going to be around for decades to come, and the Atkinson Cycle is going to be increasingly part of it. So when you read that in a brochure or somebody says it in a review, you might as well know exactly what it's about so that you can make a value judgment about whether or not a vehicle such as that is right for you. And if you want to cut right to the chase, what we're doing here with the Atkinson Cycle is we're trading off power density, like peak power production. We're giving that a little knee in the nuts so that we can extract better fuel efficiency across the normal driving sort of range of the engine, okay? And we do that with a kind of valve timing / thermodynamics hack. So let's just recap about a standard Otto cycle internal combustion engine. 4 strokes, suck, squeeze, bang, and blow. And what we're really going to talk about here is squeeze or compression and bang or expansion, okay? So you compress the working fluid in an engine, okay? And I say fluid because air is a fluid. And in the case of a multi-point injection engine, the fluid would also have atomized hydrocarbons in it that are rapidly evaporating because it's hot in there, okay? And expansion is not just like with a bicycle pump, right? It's also driven by the energetic expansion of the gas mixture because it's burning, right? And it's really energetically expanding, okay? So what you do in practice with an engine is you squeeze the fluid absolutely as much as you can so that when it burns, it throws the piston as far down the bore and as hard down the bore as it can. And what you try and do in practice is extract as much work, like mechanical work, crankshaft rotation, that's what I'm talking about, as possible. And one of the ways to do that is to squeeze the mixture as hard as you can. And obviously there's a limit to that because you don't want the fuel to burn in an uncontrolled way or prematurely because that can destroy your engine. And that's what octane rating is all about. It's resistance to that kind of premature, uncontrolled combustion. Higher octane fuels tolerate greater pressure inside the cylinder before they begin to burn in an uncontrolled way, and that allows the engine to extract more mechanical work out of each combustion event, and that's why high-performance vehicles generally demand high-octane fuel. Makes sense, right? So what we're doing with Atkinson is we're dicking around with the Otto cycle, and Mr. Atkinson did this in his shed in like 1882 or 1888, I forget. But anyway, it was a long time ago, right? And his mate Miller, they never met, but in 1957, Miller did a thing that I'll try and remember to get to as well. It's very similar. Anyway, what basically happens here is we might shorten up the compression stroke by leaving the inlet valve open for a bit longer. with Atkinson. And what this does, okay, instead of the inlet valve shutting with the piston right down near the bottom of the bore, they change the valve timing, they leave the inlet valve open for a bit longer, and what happens is the piston's moving up and it's actually pumping some of the inlet mixture back out of the inlet valve and into the inlet manifold, right? Which is kind of counterintuitive, but it plays into thermal efficiency of the engine, right? So what you get is a compression stroke that instead of being this long is only sort of this long. It's only 70 or 80% of what it is with an Otto engine. And you do lose a bit of fuel and air back out the inlet manifold. But what happens is it changes the ratio of the compression ratio to the expansion ratio. With an Otto cycle engine, compression ratio is the same as expansion ratio. With an Atkinson cycle engine, compression ratio is short, expansion ratio is long. And this allows the extraction of more work from each combustion event. So you get more work going into the crankshaft. And that means that you can use less fuel to do the same job at the wheels, essentially. Okay? So I hope that makes sense. What they try and do in reality with this kind of hack with the valve timing is they try and get the ideal sort of compression anyway. So they change how the combustion chamber is shaped and all of that kind of stuff so that you still get the same pressure at the top of the piston's movement in the bore, right? What you're actually doing is allowing more time and real estate for the expansion event, and that allows more extraction of work at the crankshaft, okay? And that's pretty clever when you think about it, but the only downside is that because you are pumping more air back into the inlet manifold, it's not participating in the combustion event. And fundamentally, power and engines are both limited by airflow. If you can jam more air into an engine, you can produce more power because you can burn more fuel with every combustion event. So what you're doing with Atkinson is you're trading that off. You can't burn as much fuel because you're pumping some of the air back out, like 20% or something of that nature, right? So you're going to suffer in terms of peak power production. That means overtaking on the highway, lap time, if you're a track sort of guy, right? It's not going to be as good at that, but it is going to be a lot better at just cruising and delivering better fuel efficiency. So what you note with hybrids, right, is that on the electrical side of a hybrid, they do this voodoo with energy management where instead of bleeding heat off through the brakes, right, and just letting kinetic energy be converted to heat and throw it away, which is what a standard sort of car does, what a hybrid does is it uses some of that kinetic energy to drive the motor backwards as a generator to generate electricity and put it in a battery, and then instead of bleeding it off and losing access to it ever again in a standard car, you get some of that energy back when you want to get going again. And that's why hybrids are really good in stop-start traffic. And the downside here is if you do a lot of highway driving in your hybrid, it's really not as good because that electrical energy management voodoo is not as available in that highway cruising mode. You're just not slowing down enough, right, to start grabbing some of that excess kinetic energy before you stop at the lights next time, right? Because no lights, flowing driving, not as good for the hybrid system. So a lot of people, when I say that, they say, oh yeah, but my Prius, my RAV4 hybrid, whatever, gets great economy on the highway. And the reason it's doing that, dude, is not because of the electrical side of the hybrid at all. It's because the combustion side is not Otto, it's Atkinson, right? And that loping along highway driving is really good for Atkinson, okay? So this is what Atkinson means. You're just not going to get as much peak performance out of your internal combustion engine, but for flowing sort of driving, it's going to be just Goldilocks because it's going to operate like this. You don't need peak power when you're loping along. You don't need that much power to drive along at 100 k's an hour or something. So really your engine is not going to be taxed in the way that it is when it makes peak power. And that's when Atkinson really rocks, when you're just kind of loping along, because you've got this compression ratio here that's comparatively short, and you've got a longer expansion phase, which allows the engine to extract more work out of each combustion event. But when you pull out to overtake a truck uphill or something, it's gonna take longer than if you had an engine with the Otto cycle. Now, the last thing is, you remember, I don't know, it must have been the late 90s or something when Mazda did some kooky stuff with supercharging, and they called it the Miller cycle, okay? The Miller cycle is really just Atkinson with forced induction. That's the easiest way to put that. And I don't know why that's kind of fallen over, more or less. They don't use it anymore. I think there's a complexity aspect to that in relation to, you know, just managing the backflow. So I think that might be a factor with the Miller cycle. I haven't really done the research on that for quite some time, so I don't want to be definitive about that and just get it wrong by winging it. But the Miller cycle is essentially just Atkinson with forced induction. So that's how that rolls. You're going to hear Atkinson a lot more. If you care about economy, good. If you care about performance, not so much.